watching in the battle, yeah. Say what you want about me, yeah, but I'm a living in the green world, and I need the air to breathe. Some will say you gotta get your kicks by removing love from a natural trip. But metal will rust and money will burn, yeah. And on the final page I ask, were you living in the green world? And did you give some in return?
Before we go out, about why we're out here today and what makes this place special, if you will. But I also wanted to just introduce Bark for those of you that are not that familiar with the organization. Bark is a nonprofit group, and we've been active on Mount Hood for 10 years now. This year is our 10-year anniversary, which is kind of an exciting milestone. And we've been focused since its inception. It's been focused on logging issues specific to Mount Hood National Forest. With the ultimate pie-in-the-sky goal being to eventually have a moratorium on any logging activity that occurs on the public lands around Mount Hood, because we think it's unnecessary. And what makes Bark unique, as opposed to other maybe direct action groups like Earth First or the Cascadia Forest Alliance, which used to be around, is that we don't do any direct action campaigns. It's all using the tools that were put in place with the National Environmental Policy Act that were intended for the public to be involved with federal actions relating to the environment. And so on for us, we use it for actions relating to timber sales. And one of our most important tools that we have are training people like yourselves to go out into the forests and visit timber sales and basically see what's happening on the ground. Because one of the biggest things that we do is we try to monitor every timber sale that occurs or that gets planned on Mount Hood. We go out to it and we make sure that the Forest Service is doing what they say they're doing and they're following the rules that they're supposed to follow, based on the rules that have been put in place for those kinds of things on the forest. But today is a little different because we're not actually visiting an active timber sale, although the area that's all around here when we were driving up Highway 35 right before we made the turnoff, and then along this road as we were driving up here, and then also along the trail we're about to go on, was a vast timber sale that was planned about 6 years ago. And this is a sort of a close-up map of it. The different colors are kind of the different types of harvesting that they were going to do in the areas. But Bark successfully stopped the sale. and I don't know if Sarah or Joe, remember why, but what's that? Yeah, Palali Cooper.
The timber sales clear cuts overlap with where they wanted to put in things like parking lots, so they weren't dealing effectively with the cumulative impacts because they were considering it completely separate from the C expansion, even though it clearly fit into the C expansion plans.
I see. So one of the interesting things I think about this sale, though, is that this dark blue patch right here is basically going directly through the trail we're going to be on today. Or actually, it's to the right of it. We're right about here right now, and we're going to be walking up this way. But the whole point of the logging in this area was to do fuels reduction, to try to mitigate wildfire. And what we're going to see today is that a natural wildfire actually ended up accomplishing the same thing. The trail we're walking on today is basically going through the heart of this burn that happened last summer, the summer of 2008, called the Gnarl Ridge fire. Basically, the area that encompasses the heart of the burn. This is a map that kind of shows the different colored squares on here are the varying burn intensity of the area, and we are right here right now. So we're going to be walking along this trail and into the sort of at the edge of the burn here. This whole area right here was just designated wilderness with the lands bill that just went through Congress. I don't know how many of you recall that. Yes. And it borders, this orange line here delineates the existing Mount Hood wilderness, and so it's basically this big piece that's going to be added onto it. And so, yeah, it's really exciting, and one of the reasons it's so cool is because this is now just a living laboratory for what happens after a severe burn goes through an area, because it was just designated wilderness. The Forest Service is not, there's no chance for anybody to go in and do salvage logging after the fire, and or any other sort of actions. One of the reasons that this was designated wilderness is because it was a roadless area, and so most if not all of the forest, or not all of it, but the vast majority of the forest on Mount Hood was logged at some point, except areas where the slopes were just so steep and so inaccessible that they couldn't get to them. So there are patches of those that still exist, but it hadn't been touched in a long time. So that the timber sale that was proposed several years ago was the first time they were going to be coming into this area in a really long time. So yeah, it's been kind of left alone for a good period. So yeah, and the fact that there are no roads going into it is kind of indicative of the fact that they haven't tried to go into it recently. There are 9,000 acres of geothermal leases that are all through this area, and I've marked them all on the map. All these individual sections on the map with a G that I've written in, they're a little bit hard to see, are all existing leases that are owned by PGE through this area, and less than 1,000 of these 9,000 acres are actually considered suitable for developing a geothermal site, but they all are concentrated right around in this area here, around the Cooper Spur area.
Where are we?
We are right here.
Where we're going.
So we're actually like just right on the edge of one of the lease areas. So the area we're going to be walking isn't part of one of the lease areas, but it's directly adjacent to it. Most of you are probably familiar with the natural gas pipeline that's proposed to go from the Columbia River all the way to Central Oregon, and that is cutting across, well, actually it's not on this map, but let's see if, like on this big map of Mount Hood down here, the pipeline is basically going down through the Clackamas district and then along the southern border of the forest right here. So it's basically this, it's a 40-mile long bisection of the forest that will have to be, the whole thing will have to be permanently devegetated to accommodate the pipeline. And so
how likely is that actually to happen? I mean,
it's, you know, it's hard to say. There are a lot of people that are really pissed off that they are even thinking about doing it, and so there's a lot of there's a very well organized effort to fight it. But right now there's it's likely that one piece of the project, which are these giant liquefied natural gas terminals that are up on the Columbia River, will probably not happen. But the pipeline itself, it's related to that project, but it's also separate. They still want to do the pipeline even if those terminals don't go in. And so that is a whole different animal, which I think a lot of people that are fighting the project itself don't understand that the pipeline could still happen even if the terminals don't go in.
So you're saying 40 miles long. How wide?
300 feet.
300 feet wide.
Yeah.
Wow.
So
Wow.
it ends up being close to 1,000 acres. 700 to 1,000 acres, and it's crossing two rivers that have wild and scenic designation, which is a federal protection that basically means you can't. It's almost like a wilderness designation for a river.
How can they do that? I don't get why. How can they do it?
In 2005, there was a act put through by Congress called the National Energy Policy Act that basically, it was a kind of a reaction to a lot of the energy security issues that are going on, or energy insecurity, I should say, and they basically gave the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission a lot of concentrated power to push through projects like this in the name of securing other alternative sources of energy other than oil from the Middle East. And so that gives them the authority to override federal lands protections like that exist on Mount Hood. So, and it's also going to cross over the Pacific Crest Trail. You know, it ends up being a timber sale, or it's not a timber sale per se, but you're going to end up with a lot of logging because of it. And the geothermal leases are another energy project that will end up in a significant amount of trees being cut down for that kind of facility, and permanently devegetated. It's a really, really high impact project that ends up not being. It ends up being surprisingly impermanent. The geothermal plants, their lifetime is anywhere from 10 to 40 years. So if you can imagine, they could go in and totally tear up an area and bore holes into the earth, and then 10 years later pull up and pack up because the resource was exhausted. And I'm not exactly sure why the geothermal, like the energy potential of them decreases over time, but the environmental impact statement that came out just recently about the geothermal releases all across the western United States basically said that's the expected lifetime of a single project is anywhere from 10 to 40 years. So
they're trying to do one EIS for all of the geothermal projects in the entire west. It's
a programmatic EIS, and so what that means is that it basically it sets guidelines for if the project in a particular place is going to happen. These are the things that you have to follow, and these are the steps you have to take to develop that project. And so it puts in place a lot of remediation techniques and specifying what you need to do when you leave, when the site is exhausted and you decide to leave, things you have to do to to try to clean up the area or whatever, and things like that. So, but it's also very general, and for specific projects, there's language in the document that says, if you want to develop in this specific area, you also have to follow the guidelines placed out in these other documents. And so it references the Northwest Forest Plan and the Mount Hood Management Plan.
You already described how the pipeline that's different. What do they do when they make a geothermal plant?
The big things that I know that go along with the project are several access roads. There's transmission lines to get the power off the site. And so if it's in the middle of the forest, can imagine if there's transmission lines going out everywhere, those have to be even wider than 300 feet to accommodate, the really big, like you've seen them coming off dams and stuff. They're huge.
Yeah.
Right.
And they have to permanently devegetate those areas too. And so those would be these huge swaths that would have to be devegetated. And because it's in the heart of the forest, in every direction you look, you've got, trees. And so they would have to just, cut those down to move the energy off the site. And then on the site itself, there are roads that need to be built, and very permanent roads too, because of the amount of infrastructure and things they'll have to be hauling into the site to build the site. So it'd be really high intensity road work. And then on the site itself, they have to devegetate a certain amount around the area for safety reasons to prevent fire. And I can't remember how many acres, but it's, dozens of acres in this particular site. And then there's facilities itself, for driving the generators and all these other things that have to be built up. And so it ends up being a pretty significant footprint. But I think what Bark is most concerned about are the transmission lines that will inevitably have to be built because of the project. Mount Hood is an active volcano, and so the leases were based on surveys that were done looking for hotspots, and so and it's also they're limited now to where the leases already exist, and most of them happen to be on public land. So, like BLM land mostly, but in this case, Forest Service land. So,
What's the possibility of getting that legislation changed?
right now, there's no active plans to develop a geothermal site on Mount Hood, but it's the programmatic EIS talked about the sites on Mount Hood specifically, and they made it sound like it was highly likely to be done in the next 10 years, but. It's just like mineral rights in an area. If you've got the mineral rights, you're allowed to come in and develop a site. And so it would basically be, I'm not really sure what we would have to do, but PGE is legally able to come in and develop a project. I guess what we would have to do is show that there was no way that they could develop the project and not have basically be able to show that there was no way that they would be able to mitigate environmental impacts enough to why am I losing my words?
Yeah.
To
No,
justify doing it.
Yeah.
So.
Wow. Well, it sounds like maybe we need to get a Seattle Power and Light in Portland to replace PGE, perhaps.
It's been tried.
Is exactly
Yeah, it
what
has
we
been tried.
need to do. After the $4.5 million bonus to the outgoing
Oh, right, I heard
executive
about
and
that.
$700,000 a year in addition to that,
Yeah.
I'm certainly for community-owned energy system.
Right. And I do have, if anybody's interested, I do have some pamphlets on the geothermal leasing, if anybody's interested to learn more. And there's a map that shows the leasing areas on the back. Geothermal heating for a house is basically just digging a deep hole and using if you go deep enough, it's a constant 55 degrees.
Right.
And that's just cycling cool
That's a
air.
different kind.
This is looking for super hot, like water or gases that are near volcanic areas or other hot spots, and you're actually using that to generate steam to drive turbines. So it's much more high.
And
It's
you have
much
to
more
transport
site-specific.
it, which you don't have to, or not that far. If you're just digging down and you're bringing it up to the house, that's different than shuttling. It's
Well, you don't have to. It all happens on site. So the turbines are. It's just. What I meant was I was talking about moving the actual electricity through the transmission lines. So, but yeah, it's all. They basically, they drill these holes into the earth and then I think they fill them with some kind of. They line the holes with like a piping material, and then they basically send through like kind of like antifreeze or something like that down into these cores. It heats the liquid up really hot, and then they cycle it back up, and then it generates steam. That's my understanding of it. Could be a little bit off there, but that's the basic idea.
I couldn't agree more with this last thing you have on here about needing localized energy rather than opening up the millions of acres of for geothermal leasing. I mean,
I think that's all I want to say for now. I'm going to stop maybe twice, maybe only once on the way to, once we get into the burn area, which will be really obvious, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some basic fire ecology and just if anybody has any questions. And I mean, fire is a very controversial and not to use a terrible pun, but hot topic at the moment in terms of its role in climate change and, you know, but it's also its natural role in the landscape and how it impacts human communities. And so I'd love to have a discussion if anybody's interested. Yeah, and then I may talk briefly about some of the localized ecology of this area because it's really neat.
I'm a true American. I stay quiet and collect my pay. I'm a true American. I stay quiet and collect my pay. I don't wanna rock the boat. I don't wanna rock the boat. I'm a true American. I don't ask any questions. I'm a true American. I stay quiet and collect my pay. I don't ask any questions. I don't wanna make any waves. I don't wanna rock the boat. I just wanna collect my pay. I'm a true American. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm a true American. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I don't care where my money comes from. I don't care who gets burned. I don't believe in unions. I get mine, I don't care about yours. I'm a true American, and I believe in baseball days. I'm a true American, and this country's so great. And I'm too busy to change. I'm too busy to change. I'm a true American, and the earth has got to pay.
I guess, and Mary started to do this already, but I just wanted to point out, and I just find this really interesting because I spend most of my time on Mount Hood on the west side, and so I'm really used to seeing, you know, a lot of Doug fir and hemlock and cedar, and it's really wet all the time and lush, and you come out here and it's a whole different story, and it's, I mean, it's in a way, I mean, it's just different, but in a way, there is some interesting diversity in terms of the tree species that are here, because not only do you have some Doug fir interspersed and hemlock, and the cedar, you know, tend to congregate in these drainages when you do see them, but then you also have grand fir and, like Mary pointed out, the western larch and some what was the pine?
Can you show me the grand
Oh,
fir,
there's a white pine here.
Oh, is that the white pine right there?
Yeah.
Yeah, the western white pine. The grand fir, I think that's a grand fir.
Where?
Right there. Not the one with the sign on it, but the one to the right of it, further back.
That one?
I believe that's a grand fir. The one other interesting thing to note too is that all the deciduous species, especially that you see in the Clackamas Basin where there's a really frequent flood cycle and you get a lot of alders popping up near the rivers and stuff, you don't really see that here, partly because there's less water, but also just I think it's just too dry and a little bit too extreme, and the big leaf maple also don't show up as much either. So I don't know. It's just that, you know, a lot of people they move to Portland and they're used to the West Cascades forest, and then they cross the crest and they're like, oh my God, it's desert. Oh my God, it's dry. Like, you know, so it's just it's kind of neat to come out to this side. So quarter mile, you're gonna start seeing evidence of burn scars on trees and some trees that were completely engulfed, and it's a real gradual transition, and then it'll become really obvious. So.
was her name, and I met her on a hot day in June. Everything she said was beautiful. It's true. It's true. It's true. It's true. It's true. Fire talks so brilliantly, I just had to smile. She could make an angel from the devil's child. It's true, it's true, it's true, it's true. Fire dressed so brightly as she took me dancing in the woods. We climb all the treetops just to get the eagle's point of view. 1 year from the first day I met her, but she would disappear, leaving me so lonely. I met her from here. It's true. It's true. It's true. It's true.
Pretty much every environment, whether it's a forest or a prairie or whatever, is on some kind of a fire regime. And fire is a completely natural part of the landscape, no matter where you are. You know, and on the high plains, it manifests as really frequent annual, really, really big grass fires that will tear up millions of acres in a couple of days, and then, you know, immediately. I mean, then that's basically how it regenerates and starts the whole cycle of grass being produced again. And then, you know, on Mount Hood specifically, there's like at least 3 fire regimes. There's the West Side Cascades, which is on a fire regime that's hundreds of years, like 400 or 500 years. And then you have low elevation Ponderosa Pine, which is like further south and more east of here, that is on a like 30 to 40 year, if not less, fire regime. And then you've got places like this mixed conifer area that's still pretty dry, that, you know, is maybe like 50 to 100 years. And so, you know, what we're seeing here is basically just, you know, it was time for it to burn, or maybe even overdue. I mean, because the one thing that's been introduced in the last 100 years in these areas is the influence of, you know, human interaction with the environment, and for a long time there's been just sort of this blanket fear around fire cropping up anywhere, and so fires were really, really aggressively suppressed in a lot of areas. And in some cases, in some environments, especially that low elevation Ponderosa I was telling you about, it's caused this phenomenon of fuels being sort of overloaded over time, because they've kept fire from happening for so long that you end up with these really, when they do go off, you end up with these incredibly high intensity fires that wouldn't normally occur in those areas. But at the same time, I hope I'm not rambling too much. At the same time, those high-intensity fires do provide a really important thing, and even like Douglas fir, for example, on the it's you know, quintessential to the West Side Cascades forest. The only way that it can regenerate really is in really exposed, high mineral content soil, which, if you have a huge high-intensity wildfire that basically burns everything, then those are the perfect conditions for Doug fir to regrow. And so that's actually how those forests end up sort of resetting over time, and then they burned it down to nothing then the Douglas fir comes back, and then eventually, there's a whole long cycle that ends up with mostly hemlocks, but that's another that's another story. So, on the other hand too, though, it is an incredibly traumatic event for an environment, just like like a logging operation is. But I mean, there's definitely some distinct differences. But there's an incredible amount of nutrients that are released both into the atmosphere and into streams, as like for example, around here and on this ridge top. I mean, there was down below and further that way. The burn was so hot that it burned everything down to the soil, and there's going to be a lot of runoff into all of these drainages into the streams in the next year, or at least this spring especially. But remarkably enough, if the soil is left undisturbed, there are still a lot of bacteria and microbes and fungi that are able to survive something like this, and they are amazing at binding up all of those nutrients that are sort of rushing by and sort of prevent a lot of that loss. Whereas if you contrasted that with, a really high intensity logging operation that's not only taking out the biomass like a fire would, but it's also, impacting the soil and crushing everything up, and it's a much more sort of, it has a much heavier footprint on the ground itself that can end up making things a lot harder to regenerate. So another thing I wanted to point out too was that, and you can see it just from being on this ridge, that even a really hot fire isn't just going to be this blanket of really high intensity burning over the whole area. Like you have a big fire perimeter, but within that perimeter there's a lot of patchiness. And that's a really important characteristic to a burn like this, because it ends up creating a lot more diversity in this, like the age of the different trees. Like this guy is going to end up, getting really old and whatever. But you can see that here, like in these areas that house these drainages, on this side and on this side, neither one of them burned very hot, and in some places not at all. And so you get these. Depending on the localized terrain, you can have fires like jumping through or jumping over these riparian areas and leaving these unburnt patches that are really important for helping the rest of the forest regenerate. And they also provide habitat for birds and other things to sort of like, use this area for for food and maybe for hanging out or whatever, but maybe they prefer to nest or whatever in the actual live trees.
This fire was put out. So
yeah, eventually. Actually,
I mean, we put it out, right? It didn't burn itself out.
It went off, and they contained it, I believe. It wasn't a very hot fire at first, and you can see on the map, sorry I keep pulling this out, but on the map, the southern part of the burn was where it initially started. And they thought that they put it out, or it went out, and it was contained, and they stopped worrying about it. But it crept up again, and it just started barreling north through this area here. And they actually, from what I understand, the people that were managing the fire waited till the last possible minute to start to contain it. They wanted it to burn, because they knew, I mean, you saw that logging project, they wanted to do fuel reduction in this area. And so they knew that it was time for this place to go off. And so they did, I think they waited as long as they could before they had to start considering the fact that there are, there's communities and the resort and everything else that were about to be encroached on. So, I mean, I think it is kind of a decent example of trying to, let an area, sort of restore to its natural state, or not restore, maybe not necessarily restore, but just sort of keep that cycle going, and then still trying to, be conscious of the fact that there are people living in the area, but that's, a whole nother issue.
So if it hadn't been contained, it probably would have gotten further and maybe burned some homes.
Yeah, it may have. But it also may have put itself out. It's really hard to say. I mean, fire is really a strange beast, and it can change on a whim, and it can change based on the terrain. But I think that they were really worried about it, sort of the speed with which it was moving, and the way that the meteorology of the time was kind of, I think, they were worried, and probably overcautious because they have to be. So.
And you said this was started naturally? Is that...
I'm not sure. I don't know, actually, if it was initially started naturally or because, somebody's campfire got out of control or whatever. In places like this, I think I'm not really sure of the ecology of a lot of the firs and stuff, but I definitely know that the ponderosa pine likes it. It likes having fire come through pretty frequently, and it has bark to withstand it for sure. That the firs and maybe the spruces that have a more delicate bark, it may take them long to regenerate, but a lot of, especially like the Doug fir cones, they crack open with the heat from a fire, and that's how they seed. So, but I'm not really sure with a lot of those specific species how they regenerate.
It's really interesting to see which trees do seem to have survived and all. Even this mountain hemlock over here, yep. Even though burned, on its backside and all, seems to be doing quite well. And I probably, several of you at least know Roy Keane, forester Roy Keane. He says if a hemlock even smells fire, it just withers, but he's not talking about mountain hemlock. I think he's talking about western hemlock, which has apparently a much thinner bark. And
further down when the fire, it wasn't so obvious that everything looked like a burnt matchstick. All of the needles were browned on a lot of those trees, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're dead. Mm-hmm. It's really hard to tell in the year after a burn which trees are alive and which aren't, it makes it doubly cool that this place is now a wilderness, because those are the prime targets for salvage logging operations that will come in, and they'll just take anything that has burnt, looks like it burnt, or the needles are dead, and they're like, oh, it must be dead, and so they'll take it. And even a tree like this just might get swept up in the mayhem, but who knows. So it's really neat that, we can rest assured that this place will be left alone for a really long time.
After the Biscuit Fire, there was a lot of controversy over whether going there and salvage logging was a better way to go. Yeah. There was some big hullabaloo about that. Has there been any move to compare now that there's areas that have been burnt, that are saved, and compare them to what they've done down there, like when they salvage log?
I know that there was one study that I know of that came out of the OSU College of Forestry that caused a huge uproar.
That's the one I was thinking.
Yeah, somebody basically, I don't know if he looked at several burns or just the Biscuit or just the B&B complex or just focused on Oregon burns, but basically was showing pretty convincingly that salvage logging operations were really highly detrimental to the recovery of forests. But I don't know that it's obviously not something that's been studied a lot, but I think that more and more, as you have district managers on particular forests, deciding to manage fire better, in my opinion, I think you'll see more opportunities for that. Just recently a colleague of mine was relating that there was was it the Okino-Wenatchee fire? It was somewhere down in the Mogollon Rim in Arizona, where the fire crossed over two national forests. In one national forest, the manager decided, oh, we're going to salvage log the crap out of this, and whatever. And the other one was just like, no, we're going to leave it alone. And so even with that one fire complex, it's going to be this really neat, that's going to be a perfect laboratory to see like which one, what happens in each one, because you just have two different jurisdictions deciding to deal with it a different way.
You're not comparing two different areas like northern Cascades and southern.
You and I are both the same. We are all one people. Open hearts and open minds. We want to be peaceful. We all live in one big world. All the boys and all the girls. You and I are both the same. We are all one people. I am you and you are me. We are all each other. All the young and all the old. You are all my brother. We are
couldn't help but notice how bad the soil was burnt down to just, there's no humus, no nothing in it. Now, it would seem to me that would be especially on these slopes, it'd be really a lot of erosion, but you didn't seem to be too concerned about it.
It does cause a lot of erosion, but the window for it is really short. I mean, even on these really heavily burnt areas, you're already seeing little bits of green come back. I mean, and the snow just disappeared up here, and so I would expect that there's going to be a lot of little green plants and flowers that are going to be popping up all over the place that are going to help mitigate that. But there definitely is there is a significantly more surface runoff after a fire like this than there would be on a normal year, for sure. And there's nutrient loss, and a lot of it ends up in the waterways.
Like
So
salvage logging would only like.
well, right, it increases that, and it also, I mean, if you notice when we're walking on this soil, it's very spongy and soft and super delicate. I mean, it's like it's in its most fragile state that it can be in, and it's you know, in its life, whatever. I don't know if soil really has a lifespan, not really, but you know what I mean. It's like it's an incredibly delicate state right now, and it's all the more reason to stay off it, I guess.
Pioneer species have, a lot of them are like nitrogen fixers, the legumes and such.
Yeah, which is really important because nitrogen loss is probably the biggest. I don't know if you want to call it a problem, but it's the nutrient that is most heavily lost in a fire, both from going up into the atmosphere as gases during the burn, and then just losses of like NO3 and I don't know.
Well, then we should just pee all over the place.
Right. So, but that's, but those, bacteria and stuff that I was talking about are play an incredibly important role in making sure that a lot of that just, it gets bound up really fast. I mean, the nutrient cycle of a forest is so incredibly tight. Like it just, it holds on to every last bit that it can. And, these riparian areas are super important in that regard too, because all of these living trees and all of that soil down there that is not as severely or maybe not at all burnt is going to be instrumental in making sure that it's basically going to hold on to a lot of that stuff that would otherwise end up in the streams. And also, I mean, the underground network of fungi and that exist in areas like this, that they're all sharing nutrients with each other. And so, the mycorrhizal fungi that are subterranean here, that are attached to the roots of all these trees, they're all sharing stuff together. And so it may take a long time, it may not get all the way up here, but all of that stuff that's still down there now is going to help, maybe bring some of it back up to the ridges.
Move it back up.
The mycorrhizal fungi can, yeah.
The fruiting
they can move.
Will sporulate, and then the spores will go in the air.
Well, that too, but it can also happen just through the soil. I mean, that's nutrient transfer, and that can be a really big deal for trees. I mean, that's the only way they can get enough nutrients to survive is through those fungi. The most important thing right now that the Forest Service needs to do is make sure that it's made public that this area is now inaccessible to motorized vehicles and inaccessible to people coming and using chainsaws to cut down firewood, and it's off limits. And that's, I mean, it may seem like not that big of a deal. They put up a sign at the boundary or whatever, but if people are used to not having that designation in this area, then it is something that needs to be paid attention to. And if they don't update their maps, their forest-wide recreation maps in their, in the ranger centers by next summer, I mean, that seems to me like a problem, because they're not letting people know that things are different. In West Cascade Forest, there tends to be, like after a fire or a landslide, things like alder and big leaf maple are the first things to come back up, because maple can sprout directly out of stumps, and alder are just like weeds.
Alder's a great nitrogen fixer too.
Yeah. So, I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
And
nodules.
but then eventually, once that acts as kind of a stabilization, but then in those forests, that's when the Doug fir are able to take hold, and they grow a lot faster upward. I mean, they just like shoot up, and then they take over, and then it often ends up killing a lot of the deciduous trees off, and then that becomes kind of the dominant species. But then that's like hemlock tends to sort of lag behind after that, and those are generally brought in from neighboring patches of forest, and those sprout off of dead Doug firs. And so as the Doug firs start to die, even the young ones from like blowing over in the wind or just any other sort of disturbances, that's when the hemlocks start to show up. And so it's kind of this, not everything comes back at once. It's this like progression. And so I would suspect that it's a similar thing here. I'm not sure what's going to show up first. I'm just not as familiar with this kind of forest, but I would guess that it's, yeah, it's just different tree species too.
What would happen out here? These trees are going to be left standing, and eventually they'll just fall over and rot, and it's all. But meanwhile, others will be coming up.
That's, yeah. I mean, basically, some of them may stay standing for a really long time and become, I mean, just fantastic habitat for birds and bugs and things like that. And a lot of them are going to fall over and just eventually become part of the soil, and enrich it. And but as they stay standing too for a long time, they do end up having a stabilizing effect as well. So, but yeah.
So it seemed like the biodiversity that thrives with snags and downed and dead trees are going to explode, which will bring in birds, which will help disperse the seed that's here, and it just has its own dynamic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's on its own timetable too, and I think that's one of the things that silviculturists or people who manage forests that they worry about is that things don't happen fast enough. It's like they want new trees in there right away, and it all comes from this view of the tree producing, or the forest producing, as opposed to just doing its own thing.
You and I are both the same. We are all one people. Open hearts and open minds. We want to be peaceful. We all live in one big world. All us boys and all us girls. You and I are both the same. We are all one people.
Oh, watching in the battle, yeah. Say what you want about me, yeah. But I'm a living in the green world, and I need the air to breathe. Some will say you gotta get your kicks by removing love from a natural trip.